We all know that following Jesus meant giving up things, but we rarely consider the sheer, immediate financial and physical brutality of that call. They weren't just skipping Sunday service, they were abandoning profitable careers, trading steady income for immediate destitution, and swapping warm beds for cold, dusty roads. Why you wouldn't last a day. As a disciple of Jesus takes a deep look at the grinding reality of their lives. In today's video, we'll talk about the massive initial shock of the abandonment tax. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. The sun hasn't yet crested the ridgelines around Capernaum, but you're already standing on the shore, the sand cool and abrasive between your toes. You don't have the luxury of a gentle alarm clock or a slow, contemplative stretch. Instead, your wake-up call is the simple, unnerving reality that the most important man you have ever met is already a quarter mile down the dusty path, and he is not looking back. You run a hand over the rough wool of your tunic, realizing with a sudden, sinking dread that this single piece of clothing now represents the bulk of your personal wealth. The call to follow was not a suggestion to add Jesus to your calendar when you had a free Tuesday. It was a demand, an immediate and brutal rupture from everything that provided stability, income, and security. Think back to the morning you left. Simon and Andrew had profitable, dependable fishing boats, instruments of a family business refined over generations and capable of providing a consistent, if hard-won, livelihood. They didn't simply drop their nets for a moment. They dropped the nets and walked away from the entire business. The boats, the crews, the contacts, and the predictable seasonal income. With no plan for liquidity, no severance, and certainly no retirement package. For Matthew, the tax collector, the decision was even more immediately disastrous. A public act of immediate professional and financial suicide. He walked away from a lucrative government franchise, turning his back on steady Roman silver and a secure future, and in doing so, he forfeited the entire social standing that came with it. This is the abandonment tax, a crippling levy on your life paid not with money, but with the immediate promise of perpetual scarcity. You suddenly find yourself in a state of chronic, unmitigated poverty, not because you are lazy, but because you willingly surrendered your means of production. There is no insurance policy for this mission, no benevolent fund to draw upon, and no way to simply go home for a paycheck when the communal purse runs empty. You traded the predictability of the next catch for the glorious yet terrifying uncertainty of divine providence. You are now, officially, broke, reliant solely on the generosity of strangers and the small, unreliable collection of coins carried by one of the 12. The psychological weight of this transition is immense. You went from being a self-sufficient man, a fisherman, a carpenter, a toll collector, to a radicalized beggar, depending on hospitality for your very survival. Your neighbors, your former colleagues, and even your own relatives now look at you with a mixture of pity and contempt, viewing you not as a spiritual pioneer, but as a man who threw away a good life for a dream that will surely fail. The shame of this destitution is a silent, constant companion, whispering doubts in the quiet moments between sermons. It is an anxiety that settles deep in your chest, knowing that the responsibility for the group's next meal rests not on your skill, but on a miracle. Worse still, you realize you have nothing left to sell. That familiar, grounding presence of stored capital, a piece of land, tools of the trade, a hidden cache of savings, is completely gone. Your entire earthly existence is now reduced to the sandals on your feet, the single tunic on your back, and the knowledge in your heart. You are exposed, vulnerable, and completely unmoored from the economic realities that govern every other person in Galilee. This poverty is the first crucible, forcing an immediate, raw dependence on a master who himself has no pillow for his head. You have paid the cost. You have emptied your pockets for the mission, and the immediate consequence is a profound, gnawing awareness of your own emptiness. There are no resources to fall back on, no comforts to rely upon, and no earthly power to leverage. All that is left to spend is your raw, physical effort. The small pain of an empty belly is replaced by the growing ache in your calves as you finally catch up to the master. You look down at your cheap, dusty sandals and realize that the next few miles and the next few years will be measured in the raw, grinding distance they must cover. With nothing left but the road, you take the first painful, unavoidable step forward. Discipleship was a job of constant, brutal walking, and this chapter focuses on the sheer physical toll of first-century travel. You have settled into the rhythm now, or perhaps the rhythm has simply broken you in. The initial, jarring shock of abandoning your old life fades into the more chronic, deeper pain of the road. Discipleship, stripped of its miraculous moments and theological high points, is fundamentally a job of endless, relentless walking. This is not a meditative stroll in a park or a measured hike along a well-groomed path. This is the raw, grinding distance of first-century travel, the only way to move the mission from one village to the next. The distance is the enemy, and your own feet are the instruments of your torment. The journey begins before the sun has done more than hint at the eastern horizon. Jesus is already moving, his pace deceptively quick, and you must hurry to catch up. The sand and pebbles already abrasive against the thong of your simple leather sandals. Your sandals are not designed for comfort. They are a compromise between protection and cost. Thin soles of hide strapped across your instep. They offer a minimal barrier against the harsh reality of the ground, a few millimeters of leather between the weight of your entire body and the unrelenting, unforgiving geology of Galilee and Judea. The roads themselves are seldom roads at all. Sometimes you are fortunate enough to find a short stretch of former Roman paving, smooth stones laid for legions long past. But mostly, you traverse goat paths, winding dirt tracks worn bare by centuries of donkey carts and wandering livestock. The surface is a chaotic mix of sharp basalt fragments, loose, choking dust, and sun-baked, uneven clay. Each step is a micro-decision, a calculation of where to place your foot to avoid the snagging root, the hidden rock, or the slippery patch of loose scree. And you must maintain this meticulous, exhausting focus for 12, sometimes 15 miles a day. The pain begins subtly, a dull ache that starts in the sole and spreads quickly into the arch. By the first hour, the friction has begun its quiet, destructive work. The leather thong, stiffened by sweat and dust, rubs the tender skin between your toes, quickly graduating from irritation to raw, exposed flesh. Blisters are not an occasional hazard. They are a chronic condition, a constellation of fluid-filled cushions on your heels and balls. You learn to walk around the blisters, shifting your gait into a series of awkward compensations that only transfer the strain higher up into your ankles and knees. By midday, your feet are swollen, heavy, and hot. The constant impact sends vibrations up your legs, leaving your calves tight and burning, like taut ropes ready to snap. You are constantly fighting the desire to stop, to simply collapse by the roadside and tear off the sandals to examine the wreckage. But the master keeps moving, and the pressure to keep pace is relentless. To fall behind is to risk missing the lesson, to risk arriving too late to secure the scant hospitality the group depends upon. You cannot afford to break the rhythm of the march. The sandals themselves become characters in this saga of discomfort. The leather cracks and stretches. The thongs inevitably break at the most inopportune times, forcing a clumsy, painful repair with a scrap of rope or whatever tough weed you can find. You look at the road not as a path to a destination, but as a long, continuous, abrasive surface designed to wear you down, physically and mentally. The dust is everywhere, a fine, reddish-brown powder that covers your feet, mixes with your sweat to form a paste, and then dries, pulling and cracking the already fragile skin. This chronic, low-level physical hardship serves a purpose in the narrative of the sleep story. It is the constant, numbing rhythm of existence. It is the simple, inescapable truth that for all the lofty spiritual discussions, a significant part of your daily energy is spent just moving your physical body. You are a road animal, defined by your ability to cover ground despite the agony. The ache in your joints and the soreness in your back are simply the drumbeat of the mission. You try to focus on the conversation, on the incredible things the Master is saying, but the pain is a persistent, selfish distraction. It is difficult to fully grasp the meaning of the kingdom of heaven when all you can feel is the fiery throb of a raw blister on your heel. You shift your weight, taking care to tread lightly, imagining the blessed relief of a patch of cool moss, which of course never appears. You envy the simple, stationary life of the shepherd or the vineyard worker, whose feet know the comfort of familiar, enclosed ground. But even this deep, bone-weary exhaustion of the feet is not the worst discomfort. As the morning progresses, a new, more pervasive torment begins to assert itself. It is a presence that is impossible to evade, impossible to ignore, and impossible to defeat through sheer willpower. It is the inescapable weight of the sun itself, rising higher and hotter above the ridges, turning the air into a thick, dry curtain that promises to drain the very water from your body. The pain in your feet is soon forgotten, overshadowed by the intense, dehydrating struggle against the relentless climate that makes every step a battle against nature. The rhythm of the steps slows, not just from the bruises beneath your sandals, but from the heat that has begun to leach the strength from your muscles. The road is now not just rough, it is radiating, throwing the stored heat of the morning back into your face. The sensation is one of being slowly baked, and the fight to keep your eyes open and your mind focused is rapidly becoming the more immediate challenge. The day's walk has transitioned into a siege, and the next few hours will be dictated entirely by the sun and the thirst it breeds. The sun has claimed the sky entirely, transforming the pale blue morning air into a brassy, blinding intensity. You are now fully immersed in the second, and arguably greater, physical hardship of the journey: the oppressive, dehydrating heat of the Middle Eastern climate. This is the tyranny of the sun, a force that doesn't just warm you, but actively works to strip your body of its essential fluids and mental clarity. You are, quite simply, operating in survival mode, dedicating precious energy just to remain upright and conscious. The heat hits the exposed skin of your neck and arms with a physical pressure, a constant abrasive force that leaves you sweating profusely within minutes of starting the day's march. It is not a humid, tropical heat, but a dry, arid blast that leaches the moisture from your skin before it can even offer cooling relief. The sweat evaporates almost instantly, taking with it vital salt and leaving a gritty film on your skin that only adds to the discomfort of your dusty tunic. Your mouth is a desert, your tongue thick and heavy, and the urge to swallow only reveals the painful dryness of your throat. This chronic, low-level dehydration is a psychological weapon. It breeds a persistent, dull headache that settles behind your eyes and pulses with every step you take. The sunlight is no longer a welcome warmth, but a painful glare, forcing you to squint and often confusing your vision. The world around you begins to shimmer and warp slightly at the edges, a sign of the dangerous heat stroke beginning its subtle ascent into your mind. It is a profound mental fog that makes grasping complex teachings or focusing on a simple task incredibly difficult. You are constantly aware of your need for water. The leather water skin, already warm and tasting faintly of the hide and the last stale pool you filled it from, becomes the most precious object you possess. Every sip is measured, a conscious decision to ration the life-giving liquid against the unknown distance to the next well or cistern. The disciples rarely drink to quench their thirst entirely. They drink only to survive the next hour, accepting that they will live in a perpetual state of longing for moisture. That first cool taste of water at the end of the day, if you're lucky enough to find a clean source, is a luxury that outweighs all riches. The air itself is thick with dust, raised by the passing feet, the donkey carts, and the occasional gust of wind. This dust, which settled on your sandals in the last chapter, now assaults your respiratory system. It coats the inside of your nose and throat, mixing with your limited saliva to form a gritty paste. Every inhale is a shallow, painful process. And the sound of your own rough, dry cough becomes another constant background noise of the pilgrimage. This dusty air further accelerates the dehydration process, creating a vicious cycle of discomfort. The master, meanwhile, continues to walk and teach. This is perhaps the most difficult part of the tyranny. Every single lesson, every powerful parable, and every profound statement is delivered Under this relentless, life-draining sun, you are expected to be attentive, to commit the divine knowledge to memory, and to remain ready to act or respond, all while your body is quietly screaming for shade and rest. You try to focus on the words, but your mind is constantly drifting, calculating how far it is to the next patch of shadow, assessing the fullness of your water skin, or simply praying for the next brief moment of respite. You learn to read the landscape, not for beauty, but for survival. You scan for the thin, welcome shadow of a large rock, the deep, cool darkness of a fig tree, or the promise of a small overhang where you might press your back against cool stone for just a moment. These brief, fleeting moments of shade are small, vital victories, providing a momentary reprieve before you must step back into the sun's merciless gaze. You watch your companions, noting their slowness, their drawn expressions, and the way they squint their eyes, confirming that this struggle is shared, though seldom spoken of. You find yourself constantly adjusting your tunic, trying to create an air pocket beneath the heavy wool to let a breath of air touch your skin. But the fabric is already saturated with sweat and dust, offering no comfort. The simple act of breathing becomes an effort, each inhale drawing in hot, dry air that does nothing to cool the core temperature of your body. You feel the slow, steady drain of energy, the weakening in your knees, the involuntary tremors in your hands. This is not the clean exhaustion of a hard day's labor. This is the slow burn breakdown of the body under siege. This external struggle against the environment is the perfect transition point. The intense need for water and shade is soon replaced by the intense, demanding pressure of the human element. The very crowds you are traveling through this heat to serve will become the next, most immediate source of exhaustion. You must endure the heat and the thirst not only to survive, but to arrive and immediately deal with a throng of people whose needs are as pressing and dehydrating as the sun itself. As you finally stagger toward the next village, you realize that the challenge of the natural world is over, replaced instantly by the overwhelming demand of the masses who wait for you. You have endured the walk, and you have survived the sun. But now, you must contend with the crowds, a living, breathing, immediate source of noise, chaos, and overwhelming demand. Jesus drew massive numbers of people, but the reality for you, the disciple, was not one of inspired worship. It was a grueling, physical job of crowd management, organization, and constant triage. You traded the solitude of the desert for the relentless pressure of the throng, and the exhaustion it breeds is total. The moment you arrive, the peace you hoped for vanishes. The crowd is not a passive audience. It is a desperate, surging sea of humanity, and you are standing directly in the breakwater. They are noisy, they are anxious, and worst of all, they smell. First-century crowds were a tapestry of odors: sun-baked bodies, dried sweat, unwashed clothing, the faint scent of charcoal cooking fires, and the sharp, coppery tang of unaddressed sickness. This sensory overload is immediate and inescapable, an atmosphere that presses down on you and further diminishes any remaining mental clarity. Your primary duty is physical, to serve as a human buffer between the master and the desperate masses. You must constantly push back, gently but firmly, against the hands that reach out to touch him, the mothers who try to shove their children forward, and the shouting men who demand his immediate attention. This is a job of relentless, draining interaction, involving thousands of micro-collisions and whispered demands. Every person is a story of need, a request for healing, a plea for help. And you are the gatekeeper standing between them and their only hope. The loss of personal space is absolute. You are always within arm's reach of a stranger, constantly jostled, bumped, and leaned against. There is no quiet corner, no moment of respite, and no privacy. Even when the master is speaking, you are managing the fringes of the crowd, quieting a baby, moving an obstreperous donkey, or trying to settle a dispute over a good viewing spot. This sustained closeness to desperate humanity is exhausting, demanding a perpetual state of vigilance and patience that few people possess. Beyond the physical management, there is the administrative chaos. These crowds must be fed, often in remote locations, and the logistical nightmare of finding food, distributing it fairly, and managing the resulting sanitation falls directly upon you and the other 11. The famous feeding of the 5,000 was not just a miracle. It was a grueling, logistical exercise that required organization, precision, and the ability to handle mass panic and demand. The work of counting, dividing, and maintaining order is a relentless, unglamorous aspect of the mission. The demands on your attention are relentless. Someone wants to know what Jesus really meant by that parable about the seed. Someone else wants to argue about the legality of healing on the Sabbath. Another demands a sign right now, just to prove he's real. You are constantly answering questions, offering counsel, and trying to convey the Master's message, all while battling your own exhaustion and the cacophony of the crowd. This is the psychological drain of perpetual availability, knowing that every single interaction is a reflection on the whole movement. The exhaustion is total. It is the deep spiritual tiredness that comes from having your energy pulled in 1,000 different directions. The heat that dried you out on the road is now amplified by the radiating body heat of the thousands of people pressed against you. The day drags on, the sermons are given, the healings are performed, and by the time the sun begins its dramatic, exhausted descent, your body is screaming for relief. You have no voice left. Your muscles ache from the constant strain of holding back the surge, and your mind is a heavy, sluggish blur of undistinguishable parables and human faces. The dispersal of the crowd is the only blessing, but even that is a chaotic process, a slow draining away of the pressure until the small group of disciples is left utterly alone. The contrast between the intense, clamoring noise of the day and the sudden, profound silence of the evening is jarring. This overwhelming exhaustion, both physical and psychological, culminates in one immediate, essential need: the promise of a place to finally rest, a place to recover the strength that the crowd has stolen. But as the final stragglers disappear, that essential need for rest quickly becomes the next disappointment. With no permanent home, no advanced planning, and no money for an inn, the immediate and most essential question becomes where you will lay your head tonight. The exhaustion from the crowd only magnifies the hardship of the subsequent realization. The lack of true, comfortable shelter is the final, recurring pain of the day, leading you toward the cold reality that there will be no pillow for the Son of Man. and certainly none for you. The sun has set. The last desperate member of the crowd has finally departed, and the deep silence that follows the day's clamor is a luxury you savor for perhaps 5 minutes. Your body, utterly depleted by the endless walking and the draining pressure of the throng, is screaming for rest. You need a secure, dark, cool place to lie down, to stretch the knotted muscles, and to finally give your blistered feet a chance to breathe. This immediate and essential need for comfort quickly becomes the next most persistent hardship of the disciple's life, the profound insecurity of shelter. You are nomads, and a nomad is a person without a comfortable home. The words of the Master echo in the sudden quiet. The Son of Man has no pillow for his head. And you realize that this is not a poetic lament, but a logistical reality that applies to you too, every single night. You have no inn to check into, no house you can call your own, and no guaranteed corner of warmth and safety. Your only hope is the fickle, unpredictable charity of strangers. A typical night of rest is a study in physical discomfort. If you are lucky, truly blessed by a generous host in a receptive village, you might find yourself in the communal upper room of a small house. But luck means accepting crowded conditions. You would be sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your 11 companions, plus the master, and often the family members of the house as well, crammed onto a hard floor of packed earth or rough stone. The air would quickly become thick and stale, heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies and cooking spices. Every turn, every stretch, every deep breath risks disturbing the precious, fitful sleep of the person next to you. More often, the hospitality is meager or entirely absent. In an unfriendly village, or when the mission takes you too far from a settlement, your rest is sought outdoors. This means finding a sheltered spot among the rocks, perhaps a shallow cave, or simply lying down in a field outside the city gates. The ground is your mattress, and it is a brutal, unyielding bed. The earth, baked hard by the day's sun, radiates heat for hours, and then turns cold and damp as the night progresses, sending a creeping chill deep into your bones. Every ridge, every pebble, every imperfection in the terrain quickly becomes a pressure point, digging into your back, your hip, or your shoulder. You pull your single outer garment, your heavy cloak, tight around you, attempting to create a thin layer of warmth against the cool night air. But the effort is often futile. True, restorative sleep is a fantasy. Your sleep is punctuated by discomfort, a sudden cramp, the persistent gnawing of a pebble beneath your rib cage, the sound of wild dogs or scavenging jackals passing nearby, the sheer mental anxiety of being exposed to the elements and the dangers of the night. Every few hours, you shift position, trying to find a configuration of limbs that might last for another hour, only to be reminded that the ground remains as hard and unforgiving as before. The contrast with your former life is stark and painful. You remember the familiar depression of your own straw mattress, the comforting weight of a blanket woven by your wife, the simple security of a locked door. You were a man of stability, your nights guaranteed by the walls of your home. Now you are exposed, your rest dictated by the movement of the moon and the whim of the wind. This nomadic existence strips away the last remnants of physical security, emphasizing your vulnerability and confirming your new status as a man divorced from the conventions of society. This chronic lack of comfortable shelter has a physical effect that goes far beyond simple tiredness. It means your muscles never fully relax. Your body never truly heals from the day's brutal walk. And your immune system remains perpetually strained by the exposure. You are always running on a deficit of rest, a state that makes the demanding work of the following day feel immediately twice as hard. The mental fog caused by the sun is compounded by the exhaustion from a night spent shifting and worrying. This deep, persistent physical discomfort, the gnawing feeling of a hard bed beneath a weary body, inevitably leads the mind to focus on the next most primal need: sustenance. The lack of a secure place to rest quickly merges with the profound lack of a secure, predictable meal. Having survived the night's exposure, you are immediately confronted with the empty feeling in your gut, an emptiness that must be addressed before the new day's walk can begin. The need for a pillow is forgotten, replaced by the more urgent, inescapable demand of the body for food, bringing you face to face with the true economics of the mission. The sun rises on a body that is weary, stiff, and utterly unrested. The brief respite of the night, such as it was, ends abruptly, leaving you with the heavy knowledge that the demands of the road are already beginning. But before the walking begins, before the crowds gather, there is the gnawing reality of the empty gut and the logistical anxiety of the day's finances. This is the chapter of the communal purse, the deep dive into the chronic financial and dietary precarity that define the existence of the Master's closest followers. Discipleship was a hand-to-mouth existence, governed by the sporadic and unpredictable flow of donations. You exist in absolute reliance on a small, shared fund, often managed by Judas, a fund that is never sufficient and never certain. The security of your former life, the guaranteed income from the fishing boat or the toll booth, is replaced by the daily, anxious calculation of available coins versus necessary provisions. It is a constant game of chance, played with the most essential necessities of life. The scarcity breeds a persistent, low-level anxiety. Every decision, from buying bread in a market to securing an evening's lodging, is viewed through the lens of extreme caution. You are constantly debating, not over extravagant purchases, but over the simple, brutal reality of survival. Should you buy 4 loaves of bread or just 3, hoping that the generosity of a host might provide the 4th? Can you afford to replace a worn-out sandal thong, or must you simply endure the blister until you reach the next, larger city where perhaps a more significant donation might materialize? Your diet reflects this economic reality. It is a monotonous, meager rotation of dried fish, coarse barley bread, and whatever wild grains or fruit you can scavenge along the path. Meals are seldom satisfying. They are purely functional, designed to provide just enough caloric energy to fuel the endless walking and the demanding work of the day. The memory of the rich, dependable feasts of your former life, the celebratory meals, the security of a full table, is a distant, tantalizing cruelty. You learn to live with a constant, low-level hunger, a bodily sensation that reminds you every hour of your radical dependence. The communal purse is more than just money. It is a symbol of vulnerability. Your dependence on charity makes you an easy target for criticism. The religious authorities and social critics look upon your poor, dusty appearance and your reliance on donations as a sign of failed leadership and lack of divine support. They see not spiritual devotion, but economic desperation, judging your meager finances as proof of the master's dubious claims. This financial precarity strips you of the right to command respect, confirming your lower social standing and making you ripe for the next hardship. Constant, aggressive scrutiny. The deep vulnerability you inhabit is entirely unlike the power they project. You are not a wealthy scholar with an endowment or a powerful priest with temple funds. You are itinerant, poor, and dependent, and this makes the established religious community view you with suspicion and disdain. They scrutinize every purchase, every action, looking for hypocrisy or financial mismanagement. This practical, daily struggle with scarcity quickly sets the stage for the relentless, ideological, and critical judgment you must endure from the established religious authorities who resent your movement. You long for the security of a stored reserve, the comfort of knowing that an unexpected expense will not collapse the entire mission's finances. But that comfort is denied, exchanged for the constant, humbling need to trust. Every meal becomes a small miracle, and every small coin that drops into the purse is a necessary relief, never a surplus. This is the economics of faith, living on the razor's edge, where the difference between having enough and going without is often separated by the size of a single sardine or the generosity of a solitary woman. This perpetual hunger and financial anxiety are the constant daily backdrop against which the Master's most profound lessons are delivered. And the next lesson is waiting not just in the sermon, but in the hostile faces that are beginning to appear at the fringes of the crowds. These are not the needy, the sick, or the curious. These are the representatives of the established order, men whose purses are full and whose bellies are satisfied, and their presence means that the scrutiny of your finances is about to give way to the relentless critical inspection of your very behavior. If the chronic hunger was the torment of the body, the presence of the scribes and Pharisees was the relentless torment of the spirit. The moment you enter a new village, you can feel the shift in the air, the palpable sense of antagonism that settles over the crowd. This is the constant religious and social critique you must endure, the cold, intellectual opposition that confirms your status as dangerous outsiders. Your life is not just physically hard, it is lived under a relentless, critical glare that seeks to expose every perceived flaw. The scribes and Pharisees were men of profound learning and immaculate social standing, and they viewed you, the rough, uneducated fisherman, the despised tax collector, with an icy contempt that cut far deeper than a beggar's scorn. Their presence created an antagonistic, cold atmosphere, an emotional deep freeze in the midst of the sun-baked crowd. They stood at the edges, often dressed impeccably, their posture rigid, their eyes narrowed in judgment. They did not come to listen. They came to test, to trap, and to publicly dismantle the fragile authority of your movement. The confrontation was often silent, beginning with the glare. It was a cutting look that conveyed volumes, a deep disdain for your lack of ritual purity, your failure to observe the established traditions, and your brazen disregard for the social hierarchy. That glare was a reminder that you had thrown away your security for a foolish venture. and that they, the guardians of the law, were watching you fail. It was an intellectual coldness that made the heat of the day irrelevant, chilling you to the bone with their profound disapproval. The silence was quickly replaced by pointed questions, meticulously designed theological traps intended to force Jesus to contradict established law, or to force you to reveal your ignorance. They did not engage in honest debate. They conducted intellectual ambushes. You, the disciples, were often caught in the crossfire, stammering to defend the Master's actions, the healing on the Sabbath, the willingness to dine with sinners, the perceived laxity regarding ritual hand-washing, the humiliation of being exposed as theological novices in front of a massive crowd was a unique and intense form of psychological pain. This constant public critique forces you into a state of perpetual defensiveness. You are never fully at ease, always anticipating the next challenge, the next public argument that will disrupt the sermon and put the Master at risk. The atmosphere is one of profound tension, a fragile calm that can shatter at any moment into open verbal hostility. It confirms the cost of your commitment, emphasizing that your path is fundamentally countercultural, and that the powers that be, the keepers of order and tradition, are actively arrayed against you. The scribes and Pharisees ensured that the world viewed your adherence to Jesus as not merely a change in faith, but a political and social apostasy. They branded you as radicals and sinners, and that reputation spread faster than any rumor. This hostile social environment created a profound sense of isolation. When a wealthy host invited the Master, you often felt the clear, palpable resentment of the rest of the dining party, who saw you as the uninvited, unwashed hangers-on. You were always the outsiders, the ones to be scrutinized, never the ones to be welcomed without suspicion. This scrutiny was particularly painful because it confirmed your estrangement from those who should have been your closest allies, your own family and community. The religious elite did their work well, painting your commitment as dangerous and foolish. This public shaming and constant judgment paved the way for the next most painful fracture in your life, the quiet, agonizing process of being abandoned by your own blood. The rejection of the larger religious society mirrored, and in many ways facilitated, the rejection of the most intimate social circle you knew. The relentless glares of the scribes eventually lead you back to the painful truth. The hostility of strangers is easier to bear than the suspicion of kin. Discipleship was not a solitary spiritual choice. It was a devastating social decision that often necessitated a painful, practical, and emotional fracture from one's immediate family and established professional networks. This chapter explores the deep, emotional, and practical pain of being cut off from familial support, the silent suffering of being viewed with contempt by those you loved. For a man in the first century, family was the core of identity, security, and economic survival. Your worth was tied to your lineage, your profession, and your contribution to the family unit. To leave that was not just a personal choice. It was an act of profound cultural and economic betrayal. Your decision to follow Jesus was viewed by your kin not as a heroic spiritual quest, but as madness, a squandering of your inheritance, and a selfish disregard for your duties to your parents, your wife, and your children. This emotional pain is often silent, festering in the quiet corners of your mind. You receive word from home, a curt message that your portion of the family business is being sold, a refusal to offer hospitality when the master's journey brings you near your native village, or the heart-wrenching knowledge that your children are being taught to be ashamed of their father. This disownment, this quiet severing of ties, is a profound wound that never truly heals. The physical hardships of the road are temporary. The pain of familial rejection is constant. The cultural gravity of being viewed with suspicion by one's own family is immense. You are not only cut off from emotional support, but from practical security. In old age or sickness, your family was your guaranteed safety net. Now that net is gone, replaced by the terrifying uncertainty of the road. This painful rejection is a powerful cultivator of loneliness, confirming that you are truly alone in the world, bound only to the other. 11. And the controversial man you follow. This isolation confirms your status as an untouchable in the eyes of society, a man whose presence brings shame rather than honor. This severance forces you into a kind of emotional homelessness, a deeper, more profound state of being unmoored than the physical lack of a pillow. You are constantly reminded that you have been replaced in the familiar routines of your former life. Someone else mans the boat, another man collects the taxes, and the rhythm of your home has moved on without you. This painful knowledge creates an internal conflict. The desire to see your family thriving, balanced against the master's demanding words about placing him above all earthly ties. This profound social and emotional isolation, and the life spent perpetually on the road, made it utterly impossible to maintain the standards of society. The result of being disowned, poor, and constantly traveling is a physical manifestation of your broken social status, perpetual lack of cleanliness. The rejection by the clean, ordered world of your family naturally leads to the next physical struggle, the literal filth of the dusty road, a dirtiness that marks you as a true outsider. You realize that this disownment is part of the tax you paid in chapter 1. The abandonment of income quickly became the abandonment of social standing, and that, in turn, became the abandonment of family. Now, your only connection to stability is the group, and your only guaranteed comfort is the dust and grit of the road itself. The emotional wound of being rejected by your family settles into the physical reality of the road. You have become an outsider, poor, dependent, and socially isolated. And that status is reflected most immediately and brutally in your appearance. This chapter is about the sensation of being perpetually dirty, of the literal and social filth that clings to you, contrasting your constant grime with the ritual cleanliness demanded by the established world. You are never truly clean. The journey is a continuous cycle of becoming dusty, sweating through your single layer of clothing, and then having the dust and sweat combine into a thick, abrasive coating of grime. You might wash your hands before a communal meal, a gesture of basic hygiene, but the notion of a full, refreshing bath is a distant, impossible luxury. You travel far from established homes. You rarely have access to clear, running water beyond the small communal cisterns. And the logistics of 12 men trying to achieve real cleanliness on the road are simply insurmountable. Your tunic is stained with the earth of every region you have passed through, patched, and worn thin in places. It carries the mingled smells of wood smoke, old sweat, and the pungent dust of the desert. Your hair is often matted and heavy, your beard caked with the dried residue of simple meals. The soles of your feet, even after a brief wash by a generous host, quickly acquire a fresh layer of grime the moment you step back onto the road. You exist in a state of perpetual, travel-worn roughness, a physical manifestation of your nomadic, insecure life. This lack of literal cleanliness quickly translates into a profound social stigma. For the people of Judea, particularly the religious elite who scrutinize your every move, hygiene was not merely about health. It was about purity. Your perpetually unkempt appearance, your inability to perform the frequent ritual washings demanded by tradition, branded you as unclean. You were not simply dirty, you were socially unacceptable, a visual offense to the high standards of ritual law. This social filth was just as heavy as the dust on your cloak, confirming to the scribes and Pharisees that you were not merely mistaken, but actively polluted. The contrast with the people you encounter is jarring. The wealthy elite, the temple priests, and the devout city dwellers maintain a standard of immaculate cleanliness, their garments spotless, their hands washed up to the elbow before every meal. When you enter their space, you carry the visible evidence of your low status and your disregard for their sacred traditions. You are the embodiment of the dirt they try so hard to avoid, and the shame of that perception is a constant, quiet burden. This external struggle with dirt and ritual purity mirrors an internal struggle to grasp the Master's own, often unclean teachings. Just as you struggle to shed the grime of the road, you struggle to reconcile Jesus' disregard for ritual, hand-washing, and his insistence that true pollution comes not from without, but from within the heart. The Master's teachings often feel as rough and unrefined as your beard, challenging the clean, neat, ordered box of tradition you were raised within. You find yourself constantly trying to scrub away the grit of the road, just as you try to scrub away the confusion of the parables. The literal filth is a constant, physical reminder that you are not capable of maintaining the standards of society, while the intellectual frustration of the Master's deep sayings suggests you are not yet capable of grasping the standards of the kingdom. The two kinds of uncleanness merge. The rough, dusty exterior reflecting a mind that is just as often confused and struggling. The relentless travel and the scarcity of water make this physical struggle a daily failure. You are perpetually out of step, too dirty for the world, and often too slow for the Master. The inability to fully clean the body is a practical, exhausting problem. But the inability to fully clean the mind, to immediately grasp the pure, simple truth of the kingdom, is the far greater intellectual challenge. This failure to comprehend the deeper meaning of the Master's words, even as you walk right beside him, is the next profound source of anxiety and self-doubt that will define your discipleship. The perpetual physical dirt of the road settles into a deeper layer of intellectual frustration. You are walking beside the greatest teacher the world has ever known, privileged to hear his words daily, yet you feel perpetually perplexed, constantly operating on the edge of comprehension. This is the silent internal psychological struggle of being a student who consistently fails to fully grasp the lesson, even when the lesson is delivered with perfect clarity. The Master's teaching method, the parable, is the primary source of this intellectual anxiety. He speaks to the massive crowd in simple, earthy stories, tales of sowers and seeds, fig trees and prodigal sons, lost coins and wedding feasts. The crowd listens, nodding along to the familiar rhythm of agricultural life and common human drama. Yet they miss the sharp, revolutionary heart of the message. But if the crowd misses it, you, the inner circle, are often not far behind. The narratives are deceptively smooth, crafted from the common stuff of village life. Yet they conceal spiritual and political explosives that you only recognize moments later, after the fuse has already been lit. You often catch yourself focusing on the mundane detail, the size of the pearl, the exact count of the talents, and completely overlooking the terrifying scale of the kingdom's demands or the impending weight of judgment. When the multitude disperses, the disciples inevitably gather around him, asking the humiliating, necessary question, what did that one mean? The simplicity of the imagery clashes violently with the complexity of the theological implications. A story about yeast, a common ingredient, is suddenly revealed to be a warning about the corrupting influence of the Pharisees. A tale about a wealthy vineyard owner becomes a terrifying prophecy of judgment. You realize, with a sinking dread, that you heard the story, but entirely missed the essential meaning, proving that physical proximity to the Master does not guarantee spiritual insight. This recurring pattern of initial confusion, followed by painful, necessary explanation, is a constant drain on your self-esteem. It forces you to confront the limits of your own wisdom, confirming that you are, in the end, just a simple man struggling to process divine truth. This intellectual struggle breeds profound self-doubt. You were chosen. You left everything behind. You are the designated keepers of the message, yet your comprehension is perpetually shallow. You feel unequipped, ill-suited, and intellectually slow. You look at the Master's face, seeking a key, a hint, a moment of profound understanding, only to find him patiently explaining what you should have understood instinctively. This gap between the profound depth of his teaching and your own limited capacity is a constant, grating friction on your soul. You are plagued by the thought that perhaps you were chosen by mistake, that a scholar or a devoted student from Jerusalem might have served this purpose better. Someone whose mind was already trained to dissect Scripture and understand prophetic language. You are expected to convey the message to others, to articulate the truths of the kingdom, to receptive and hostile audiences alike. But how can you teach what you yourself only faintly grasp? The anxiety peaks when the Master sends you out alone, asking you to preach repentance and announce the imminent arrival of the kingdom. You rely heavily on memorized phrases and familiar scripture, terrified of being asked a probing question you cannot answer, or worse, misrepresenting the very heart of the Master's revolutionary call. The words feel like fragile, borrowed things in your mouth, lacking the master's fire and authority. When people challenge you, asking for clarification on the difficult points, you often resort to nervous smiles and vague references, desperate not to reveal the true extent of your own confusion. The feeling of failure is compounded by the knowledge that the world's greatest scholars, the scribes and the temple elite, find his teaching blasphemous or contradictory. You struggle to defend a message that is as confusing to you as it is offensive to them. You desperately want to be the sharp, insightful student, but time and again, your slowness forces the master to sigh, to explain, to simplify the divine truth down to the level of simple men struggling with their fishing metaphors. The conversations that follow the parables are often the most intimate, yet they are also the most revealing of your inadequacy. You feel the weight of his mission pressing down on your limited understanding, knowing that the entire future of the movement relies on you correctly interpreting and remembering every word. You worry not just about misunderstanding, but about forgetting, about having the essential key to a parable slip away in the chaos of the day. This is the psychological burden of being a man of action, forced into a role of contemplation and scholarship. Your hands are suited for nets and wood, not for grasping the subtle nuances of prophetic language. You yearn for direct, plain instructions, but the master insists on revealing truth through layered, metaphorical language. The frustration is intense. You are there, you are listening, you are trying, but the meaning constantly dances just beyond your intellectual reach. This persistent mental effort, this constant stretching of your uneducated mind, is as exhausting as the physical miles you walk. It demands an intellectual humility that burns away the last remnants of your former pride. This deep-seated intellectual failure, the inability to consistently comprehend the theory of the kingdom, naturally and inevitably sets up the next great struggle, the difficulty in putting that theory into powerful practice. You are given authority to heal and to cast out demons, yet your struggle to understand the spiritual mechanics of the kingdom is about to be painfully confirmed by your public failure to perform the very miracles expected of you. The failures of the mind are soon to be mirrored by the failures of the spirit. Having struggled through the intellectual confusion of the parables, you now face the crushing, public humiliation of spiritual impotence. The Master granted you authority, a miraculous mandate to heal, to cleanse, and to drive out the spiritual forces arrayed against humanity. But time and again, that authority feels like an empty promise, a key that refuses to turn in the lock. This chapter is a dark, painful counterpoint to the brief, exhilarating moments of success, focusing instead on the constant failures, the public embarrassments, and the sharp rebukes that define your attempts at the miraculous. The moment of failure is always a public spectacle, unfolding in the full view of the clamoring crowd and the skeptical eyes of the religious authorities. It happens when a desperate father kneels before you, pleading for his child possessed by a vicious spirit, or when a blind man reaches out for a touch that will restore his sight. You step forward, filled with a mixture of trembling hope and sheer terror, repeating the words the Master taught you, invoking the power that you know resides in the mission. You command the spirit, you rebuke the sickness, and then you wait, your entire being focused on the expected, triumphant manifestation of divine power. And nothing happens. The silence that follows your command is not the hush of awe, but the deep, heavy silence of disappointment. The spirit rages louder, thrashing the child with renewed violence. The fever burns hotter, visibly draining the life from the patient. The darkness remains absolute in the blind man's eyes. You try again, with more desperate force, with louder conviction, perhaps even trying to imitate the master's tone. But the result is the same: profound, embarrassing failure. You look down at your trembling hands, wondering if the power has bypassed you entirely, or if the master has subtly withdrawn his grace. The desperate father looks up at you with a gaze of crushing disappointment, his initial flicker of hope extinguished. The crowd, which was silent and expectant, begins to mutter, their cynicism confirmed. They are not merely disappointed, they feel cheated, seeing you as little more than false healers, another disappointment in a life already full of suffering. The religious elite, the ever-present scribes, exchange knowing, triumphant glances, their judgment confirmed. Your lack of success validates their belief that the master and his followers are not of God, but merely charlatans. This humiliation is a deep psychological shame, born of the gap between the monumental spiritual task and your meager spiritual maturity. You feel utterly inadequate, small, and exposed. You are supposed to be the agents of the kingdom, the conduits of divine power. Yet you are less effective than the most junior, skeptical exorcist in the region. The failure confirms the distance between the potential of the mission and the weakness of the messenger. You are forced to confront the chilling possibility that you are spiritually deficient, that your faith is too small, or your heart too impure to handle the gravity of this power. This internal struggle, the self-condemnation, and the public shaming becomes a constant pressure that makes every subsequent attempt at healing an act of overwhelming dread. The failure often culminates with the master's inevitable arrival. He enters the scene of your shame, immediately grasping the full scope of your spiritual feebleness. His rebuke, though gentle in tone, is devastating in effect. "O faithless generation," he often says, "how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you?" He casts out the demon, or commands the healing with a simple, effortless word, demonstrating the ease of the power you failed to access. This is not merely correction. It is an expression of deep, wounded frustration at your inability to simply trust the power that has already been given. You realize that the problem is not a lack of power in the mission, but a catastrophic failure of faith within your own heart, a spiritual block caused by your own doubt and lack of purity. This constant, repeated failure to perform the expected miracles creates profound self-doubt that undermines all your previous sacrifices. You question why you left your nets, why you endured the hunger, and why you accepted the rejection of your family, only to find yourself publicly failing in the very tasks you were chosen to perform. The knowledge of your spiritual inadequacy is a constant companion, reinforcing the need for complete reliance on the Master. This experience of constant failure, the unsuccessful healing, the uncast demon, the public ridicule, lays bare the immense gulf between what the master demands and what you are currently capable of delivering. This feeling of overwhelming inadequacy and spiritual weakness makes the subsequent radical moral and ethical demands of the master even harder to accept and live up to. If you cannot even heal a fever with a word, how can you possibly turn the other cheek or truly sell all you possess, as the master will soon demand? The practical failure leads directly to the moral trial of the hard sayings, forcing you to confront the cost of true obedience. The failures in the realm of the miraculous serve as a stark prelude to the final, deepest trial of discipleship, the trial of the hard sayings. Having struggled with the physical demands of the road, the intellectual complexity of the parables, and the public shame of spiritual failure, you now face the demanding internal conflict of the Master's revolutionary ethical and moral demands. His teaching is not always comforting or gentle. Sometimes it is aggressively difficult, forcing you to dismantle your most fundamental cultural beliefs, traditions, and self-preservation instincts. This is the psychological conflict between the gentle Savior who heals the sick and the revolutionary prophet whose words threaten your entire sense of self and social order. You love the Master. You trust his divine power. But his demands are often so radical, so countercultural, that they cause a deep, internal, moral shockwave that leaves you wrestling with your conscience long after the words are spoken. You signed up for a spiritual transformation, but he seems to be demanding a social and political revolution that starts brutally with the destruction of your own ego and personal security. He tells you to love your enemies, an unthinkable proposition in a world defined by honor, retaliation, and familial loyalty. You are a man raised in a land simmering with resentment against Rome and the corrupt priesthood. The idea of actively blessing those who curse you feels like an inversion of justice, a betrayal of your national pride. He demands that you turn the other cheek, to give your cloak as well as your tunic, and to walk an extra mile with your Roman oppressor. These are not mere suggestions. They are impossible ethical standards that challenge the very core of your Judean identity, your masculine honor, and your deeply ingrained desire for swift, visible justice. You argue about these things with your fellow disciples in whispers, trying to find a loophole, a metaphor that might soften the impossible sharpness of the command. The hardest sayings are often about commitment and personal security. He tells you to sell all that you possess, to deny yourself, and to take up your own cross. This is not the abstract poverty of the road you already endure. This is a willful, radical self-denial, a complete abandonment of all future comfort and aspiration. The financial anxieties of chapter 6 return, amplified by a direct demand for absolute sacrifice. You hear the words and feel the immediate, agonizing resistance of your own self-preservation instinct, the deep, primal need to hold on to something solid. The very idea of the cross, a Roman instrument of torture and ultimate public shame, is terrifying, confirming that the commitment requires not just your money, but your life itself. You find yourself struggling to reconcile the kingdom of God, a divine, transcendent reality, with the immediate, visceral needs of your human life. How can you be a follower of God and yet hate your father and mother, as his words sometimes imply? You know he means placing him first, but the language is so absolute, so uncompromising, that it forces you to confront the painful reality of the family ties you severed in chapter 8. How can you live in this world without planning for the next harvest, without ensuring a secure future for your own dependents? The Master's words are like a two-edged sword, slicing through the comfortable layers of tradition and self-interest that have defined your entire life. This internal moral shock leads to arguments, whispered disagreements among the 12, and sometimes a direct, fearful challenge to the Master himself. You are not ready for this level of self-annihilation. You signed up for a spiritual revolution, for the establishment of a glorious new physical kingdom where you would sit on thrones. But he seems to be demanding the destruction of your own physical being and emotional comfort. Many who followed him walk away at this point, unable to bear the weight of such radical commitment. They prefer the clean, predictable path of tradition to the messy, life-altering path of the prophet. But you stay. You stay because, despite the impossibility of the sayings, you know that he alone has the words of eternal life. The gentle face of the healer and the uncompromising voice of the prophet are one and the same, and the moral conflict does not disappear. It remains a heavy, unresolved tension. This internal struggle, the agonizing attempt to align your human, self-interested soul with the Master's divine, self-sacrificing demands, builds inexorably toward the ultimate, defining moment of high risk, the growing political and physical danger that surrounds him. His hard sayings and radical demands are not just spiritual tests, they are political fire starters, escalating the opposition from the scribes into outright hostility. The political temperature is rising, and you know, with a chilling certainty, that the path you walk is leading not just to personal sacrifice, but to actual, physical confrontation with the powers of Rome and the temple. The journey of poverty and failure is culminating in the ultimate threat of violence and death, and there is no turning back. The moral and ethical demands of the hard sayings, the call to self-denial, and the abandonment of personal vengeance only make sense if you understand the sheer, pervasive danger surrounding you. Like the Victorian baker working next to combustible flour dust, the disciples worked their ministry in a politically explosive and volatile environment. This chapter details the constant, low-level risks of being recognized and targeted by hostile local thugs, suspicious Roman soldiers, or religious zealots. The perpetual anxiety of a sudden riot, a swift stoning, or an arbitrary, brutal arrest. Your public life is lived under a continuous, low-grade fever of fear. Every major city, every market square where the Master preaches is a potential trap. You are not obscure beggars anymore. You are the notorious entourage of a man whose claims are widely considered seditious by Rome and blasphemous by the temple. Your simple act of standing on a stone step and speaking is an act of high political risk. The very air around you seems charged, ready to ignite into chaos at the slightest provocation. The risks manifest in several ways, each equally chilling. First, there are the local thugs and aggrieved community members. If the Master heals someone's slave and exposes a local superstition, or if he criticizes a local leader's hypocrisy, the reaction is not gratitude. It is often rage, fueled by injured pride and economic loss. You have already experienced moments where the crowd's mood shifted violently, where the applause turned into a threatening roar, and you had to hustle the Master away from grasping, angry hands, sometimes nearly resulting in a fatal fall from a cliff. That sudden, visceral shift from reverence to violence is a deeply unnerving constant. Then there are the omnipresent Roman soldiers. They stand apart, their polished armor and impassive faces a brutal reminder of the ultimate secular authority. They do not care about your theological debates. They care about order. A crowd of 5,000 people listening to a charismatic leader is not a religious gathering to them. It is a potential insurrection, a mob that needs to be monitored, controlled, and, if necessary, dispersed with extreme, unforgiving violence. You, the close companions of the leader, are the most recognizable targets. Every time a legionary's gaze lingers on you for too long, a cold dread washes over you. The immediate anxiety of being dragged away for questioning, for torture, or for arbitrary execution under the immense, crushing weight of Roman law. The fear is not just of a planned attack, but of the random, unpredictable nature of violence. A zealous Pharisee could decide your presence in his synagogue is an abomination, leading to an immediate, organized stoning. A zealot could decide that the master is a failed Messiah who needs to be forced into action, leading to a kidnapping attempt or a chaotic public confrontation. The peril is pervasive, requiring you to constantly scan the crowd, not just for the sick who need healing, but for the angry faces, the hidden knives, and the suspicious movements that signal impending danger. You have become the master's shield, a human barrier between him and the volatile world, and this perpetual vigilance drains you as completely as the physical walking. This constant, pervasive fear of being targeted for your association with Jesus is the hidden tax of public ministry. It steals your peace, sharpens your reflexes in fear, and reinforces your dependence on the Master's presence, which seems to exert a strange, invisible force field against true catastrophe. Yet, this atmosphere of fear and the imminent threat of Roman crackdown connects immediately to the specific ideological scorn you receive from political factions within Judea, especially those who believe you should be capitalizing on this public danger rather than avoiding it. The political storm is gathering, and you realize that you are not just a religious movement. You are a political symbol, viewed with profound disdain by the very people who should be your national allies. The pervasive threat of Roman arrest and random violence in public ministry serves as the grinding backdrop to the most painful ideological rejection, the scorn of your own people. The political pressure on Jesus was immense, and the disciples were caught in the impossible, tightening vice of conflicting Judean factions. This chapter focuses specifically on the deep ideological contempt felt from the aggressive, nationalistic zealots, who viewed the disciples not as agents of salvation, but as weak, nonviolent failures who were squandering the perfect opportunity for military revolution. The zealots represent the kind of discipleship you secretly wished for. They are men of action, men who understand power, and men who are ready to shed blood for the freedom of Israel. Their mission is clear, patriotic, and violently direct. Remove the Roman yoke by force. You admire their fierce, unbending commitment to the law and to the sanctity of the Holy Land. Yet, your own ranks include Simon the Zealot, a man who, despite his conversion, embodies the profound tension between this revolutionary ambition and the Master's call to peace. When you encounter the zealots, Whether in the busy markets of Jerusalem or in the remote villages of Galilee, the interaction is characterized by cold, cutting scorn. They look at your dusty, unweaponed group and see only missed opportunity. They cannot comprehend why a man capable of feeding 5,000 people with a few loaves, or walking on water, or commanding demons, would not instead command an army. Your ministry of healing and teaching is interpreted as spiritual softness, a cowardly evasion of the national duty to fight. The ideological scorn cuts deeply because it plays on your own residual, unpurged nationalistic feelings. You, too, struggle to reconcile the Master's nonviolence with your deep longing for a political Messiah, a king who would finally sit on David's throne and throw off the oppressor. The Zealots articulate the very ambition that occasionally stirs in your own heart, the desire for decisive action, for a display of overwhelming force that would silence both the Romans and the cynical Pharisees. Their presence is a constant, tempting argument against the Master's patience and his focus on an internal spiritual kingdom. They challenge you with pointed questions, not theological traps like the scribes, but strategic, nationalistic barbs. When will he gather the legions? Why does he allow the Romans to walk free? Is he afraid to strike the enemy? Their rejection is deeply political, a judgment that you and your master are not serious revolutionaries, but dreamers indulging in a self-serving, pacifist delusion. This internal ideological conflict between their violent ambition and your mission of love and peace highlights the immense difficulty of your transition from simple laborers to complex religious thinkers and moral agents. The scorn of the Zealots forces you into an uncomfortable, new, intellectual space, defending a theological vision that demands humility over heroism and suffering over armed triumph. You have to use words and rhetoric to counter the simple, brute force logic of the nationalist cause, a task for which your hands-on professions never prepared you. This profound intellectual shift from being men of simple, reliable action to men of complex, profound words is the next great hurdle in your discipleship. This transition is not just about learning doctrine, it is about reshaping your entire worldview. You must suppress the deep, satisfying urge for vengeance that the Zealots champion and embrace the radical, weak-seeming power of forgiveness. The tension is immense, forcing you to choose every day between the familiar, patriotic path of violence and the terrifying, uncertain path of the kingdom. The scorn of the Zealots is a bitter price paid for your loyalty to a king who refuses to fight with a sword. The scorn of the Zealots exposes the fundamental crisis of identity faced by the disciples. The profound, dizzying professional and intellectual shift from men of simple, reliable action to men of complex, profound words. This chapter details the immense difficulty of transitioning from the reliable work they knew, fishing, mending nets, collecting taxes, to the complex, rhetorical, and deeply spiritual labor of spreading a gospel they themselves barely understood, emphasizing their crushing intellectual inadequacy. In your former life, success was tangible, measurable, and predictable. A good day meant a full net. A good month meant a full ledger. Your hands knew the familiar, comforting textures of wood, rope, and coin. Your work was defined by concrete results, by muscle memory, and by the rhythms of the natural world. There was a simple, profound dignity in knowing that you provided for your family through your own strength and skill. Now, your labor is entirely abstract, invisible, and often frustratingly intangible. Your work involves grappling with the metaphysical, the nature of sin, the conditions of the kingdom, the demands of eternal life. The tools of your trade are no longer the sturdy net and the sharp knife, but metaphor, prophecy, and scripture. You are forced to become theologians, rhetoricians, and spiritual authorities, roles for which you received no schooling and possess little natural aptitude. The intellectual inadequacy is a constant grating weight. You look at the crowds, realizing that the survival of their faith, the understanding of the Master's identity, and the very message of salvation rest on your ability to articulate complex truths clearly using language you often stammer over. Your mind, trained for the straightforward logic of the marketplace, struggles with the paradoxes, the hyperbole, and the deep prophetic layers of the Master's teaching. The intellectual exhaustion is immense. You spend hours after the sermons not resting, but struggling to commit the core message to memory, rehearsing the parables, and trying to anticipate the next unanswerable question from the ever-present scribes. The transition from a life of routine, muscular exertion to a life of intense, abstract thought causes a deep, persistent mental strain. You miss the simple, reliable exhaustion of hauling nets, an exhaustion that brought sleep and satisfaction. The exhaustion of the mind is different. It is corrosive, breeding doubt and anxiety. You are constantly on edge, worried about misrepresenting the message, worried about being exposed as frauds, and worried that your spiritual weakness will betray the monumental truth you carry. The very nature of spiritual labor is difficult to grasp. When you cast nets, you saw the fish. When you preach, the results are often invisible, slow, or even negative. The lack of reliable, immediate feedback makes the work feel fragile, built on air, especially when contrasted with the public failures in performing miracles detailed in chapter 11. You find yourselves debating, arguing, and even fighting among yourselves over trivial points of honor and rank, a reaction born from the deep insecurity of your new, undefined profession. If you cannot measure success in silver or fish, you try to measure it in proximity to the Master or perceived status within the small, desperate group. This intense mental strain, the perpetual struggle to be the intellectual and spiritual pillars of a world-changing movement, is interrupted by a terrifying external force, a sudden, stark reminder that for all your newfound theology, you remain utterly dependent on the physical world. Just as your minds are swimming in the abstract confusion of the kingdom, the earth and the water themselves are about to rise up and demand your immediate, primal attention. The anxiety of spiritual inadequacy is about to be replaced by the sheer, unadulterated terror of the natural world. The mental strain of wrestling with theology is brutally and immediately shattered by the sudden, inescapable power of nature. Even for the seasoned fishermen among them, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, the Sea of Galilee was terrifyingly unpredictable, a volatile lake notorious for its sudden, violent transformations. This chapter is an immersive, sensory experience of one of those terrifying storms, focusing on the sheer physical fear, the cold spray, and the overwhelming feeling of being utterly helpless against the unleashed elements, even with the master sleeping soundly nearby. The day had been calm, deceptively peaceful. The heat of the afternoon had faded, leaving behind the cool, smooth surface of the lake, reflecting the deepening blue of the sky. The master, exhausted from the endless demands of the crowd and the constant ideological battles, finally found a moment of rest, curling up asleep in the stern of the boat. You and the others, tired but relieved by the quiet glide of the journey, feel a brief, blessed moment of ease. But the Sea of Galilee is a geographical anomaly, a bowl of water nestled between high hills. The cold air pouring down from the surrounding heights meets the warm air over the lake's surface, and the change is instantaneous and catastrophic. Without warning, the wind hits the boat like a physical hammer. The smooth water surface is instantly shredded, replaced by massive, churning black waves that rise up with terrifying speed. The sky darkens, the wind shrieks, and the boat, your familiar home, becomes a frail, bobbing toy at the mercy of the tempest. The sensory assault is complete and overwhelming. The cold spray hits your face and eyes, blinding you, stinging your skin, and instantly soaking your worn tunic. The rain begins to fall, not in drops, but in icy sheets, mixing with the foam of the crashing waves. The sound is deafening. The roar of the wind, the explosive crash of water against the bow, and the frantic, splintering groan of the wooden hull. Despite your years on this water, a primal, bone-deep fear grips you. You are men who know boats, and you know, with the chilling certainty of experience, that this is not a storm you can simply ride out. The boat is filling rapidly with water, and the effort to bail and to hold the sail is a desperate, losing battle against the overwhelming might of the lake. Your muscles scream as you fight the rigging, your feet slipping on the slick, waterlogged deck. In the midst of this chaos, the most terrifying sight of all is the master, still sleeping soundly in the stern, undisturbed by the cataclysm raging around him. Your fear shifts from the physical terror of drowning to the spiritual desperation of feeling abandoned. In a moment of sheer panic, one of you shakes him violently, shouting over the roar of the wind, "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" His reaction, the quiet calm rising, the simple, commanding voice rebuking the wind and the waves, is a miracle witnessed in the most extreme, terrifying circumstances. The sudden, unnatural stillness that follows the command is almost as frightening as the storm itself, leaving you soaked, shivering, and utterly humbled by the true, unimaginable nature of the power you follow. You realize that your efforts, your strength, and your experience as fishermen are utterly meaningless when confronted with the vast power of creation. This moment of extreme, shared physical peril on the water contrasts sharply with the internal, hidden tension within the group that was festering beneath the surface. While the storm was external and obvious, the tension within the group's small financial system was silent and insidious. The collective fear of drowning is quickly replaced by the cold, dawning suspicion that someone among them is not trustworthy, that the very safety of the group's meager finances is compromised, leading your thoughts inevitably back to the man who holds the communal purse. The terror on the water, with its immediate, primal threat, quickly fades into the background, replaced by a more insidious, psychological anxiety. The silent, growing suspicion surrounding the communal purse. This chapter focuses solely on the stressful responsibility and underlying burden of the communal funds, which were often managed by Judas. It explores the quiet, low-level tension and burgeoning doubt that existed due to the scarcity of money and the psychological power this management position held, illustrating the subtle, slow way that trust was eroded among the group before the actual betrayal. The erosion of trust culminates in the next, most primal, and inescapable failure: physical exhaustion. In a life defined by total poverty, every coin becomes monumental. The funds were meager, a collection of voluntary donations from generous followers, supplemented by small, unpredictable gifts from those who benefited from the master's healing. This money was the sole buffer between the 12 and utter destitution, responsible for all necessities: bread, oil, sandals, ferry fees, and the small, essential payments required for passage through certain regions. Its scarcity, combined with its necessity, gave the person who managed it an enormous, quiet power over the group's daily life. A power that Judas was uniquely positioned to wield. Judas carried this burden, a role that demanded he be the perpetual counterpoint to the master's boundless spiritual idealism. As the designated treasurer, he was the only one who truly knew the depths of your poverty and the constant, desperate need to stretch every denarius. While the master spoke of faith that could move mountains, Judas was forced to deal with the harsh, fixed reality of the market. He was the one who had to say no to requests for better provisions, or to haggle for lower prices, or to decide which boat fare was too expensive. His responsibility required a constant necessity for calculation and sometimes parsimony that others, living in the glorious oblivion of having no personal financial responsibility, could afford to ignore. This necessity of being practical in the face of impossible spiritual idealism created the first and deepest point of friction, the first seed of suspicion. The rest of you, steeped in the doctrine of divine providence, saw Judas's caution as spiritual weakness. When a needed item, a new tunic for the master, a better balm for the sick, was denied, the refusal always came through Judas. He became the face of scarcity, the practical impediment to the boundless generosity the master seemed to command. This created a natural, psychological resentment. In the fevered, idealistic chaos of following the Messiah, Judas was the one who insisted on the limits of human finance, and that cold realism felt like a lack of faith, a spiritual corruption. The tension was often unspoken, communicated through sidelong glances and hushed questions among the 10 others. They began to notice small, unsettling details, magnified by their own anxieties about their future security. A trip to the market that seemed to take too long. A lingering pause when asked for a specific account of the funds. The money pouch, a small leather item that was never far from his side, became a focal point of anxiety, a visual symbol of the group's precarious existence and the secret, unknown amount it contained. When the group was hungry, the pouch felt accusingly heavy. When funds were mysteriously low, it felt suspiciously light. You knew, intellectually, that the ministry required funds, but the management felt increasingly shrouded in an unnecessary secrecy that chipped away at the bedrock of trust. The very nature of his management felt secretive, isolating Judas and forcing him to carry the immense psychological weight of the group's survival. He had to listen to the master preach absolute trust in God, while knowing that the next day's meal depended on the goodwill of strangers or the contents of that small leather bag. He was trapped between two opposing forces: the sublime, non-material demands of the kingdom and the crushing, immediate demands of the Roman economy. This conflict made him distant, withdrawn, and prone to the very rationalizations that would later destroy him. This slow erosion was more painful than a sudden theft. It was the creeping doubt that corrupted the communal spirit. The disciples were meant to be a single-hearted family, united in myth. Yet the presence of this silent, financial friction created an artificial hierarchy and an invisible wall. It was a failure of the community before it was a failure of the man. The constant preoccupation with money, where it came from, how it was spent, and whether it was sufficient, was a constant distraction from the master's spiritual lessons. The lack of accountability, though accepted by the master in his complete trust, became a breeding ground for suspicion among the men who needed concrete proof. The others, burdened by their own sacrifices and their gnawing uncertainty, looked for a simple human explanation for their continued destitution, and Judas, with his bag and his calculations, provided an easy target. This hostile, isolated environment tragically made his final, horrible choice easier. This intense psychological pressure, however, is now set aside by a more basic and inescapable failure: the complete collapse of your own physical endurance. The psychological burden of suspicion and the gnawing anxiety of the communal purse are suddenly rendered meaningless by a physical reality more basic than faith or finance: the total, crushing exhaustion of the human body. This chapter describes the profound physical and psychological toll of discipleship, focusing on the moment in Gethsemane where you, the core group, physically could not stay awake. A fundamental failure of the flesh that overshadowed all spiritual intentions and exposed the limits of your human resolve. Your life has become a relentless, grinding cycle of activity without adequate recovery. The relentless pace of the ministry demands constant movement. You are constantly walking, often covering vast distances on rough roads under the relentless Mediterranean sun, only stopping when the master deems it necessary to preach or to rest for a few short hours. Your diet is erratic and unpredictable, consisting of what is available, often dry bread, dried fish, and whatever fruits you can gather or are offered by the fleeting hospitality of the crowds. You sleep in barns, on cold floors, or huddled together in small, drafty rooms, never achieving the deep, restorative rest of a settled life. The lack of proper rest accumulates, building up a spiritual and physical debt that is impossible to repay. This chronic lack of rest has resulted in a pervasive mental fog. Your days blur together, defined by the noise of the crowds, the heat of the arguments, and the endless stream of desperate supplicants. The intellectual strain of the parables, the constant political vigilance required in the volatile regions you traversed, and the pressure of trying to perform miracles have left your minds operating at a dangerous minimum. Your spiritual reserves are depleted, worn thin by the continuous stress of failure and the unrelenting demand for perfection. You are functioning on pure adrenaline and spiritual momentum, but the body is keeping a separate, unforgiving ledger. The persistent aches in your muscles, the dull throbbing behind your eyes, and the sluggishness of your reactions are all signs that your commitment has pushed your physical form past its breaking point. The climax of this exhaustion is Gethsemane. The setting is one of intense spiritual gravity, the silent, cool refuge of the olive grove, contrasting starkly with the spiritual storm raging within the Master. He has led you, the core group of three, to this secluded place, asking for the simplest, most fundamental act of loyalty and support. Stay awake, watch, and pray. He knows the spiritual trial that is coming, the ultimate confrontation between his divine will and his human fear, and he asks you to stand guard, not with swords against an enemy, but with vigilance against your own weakness. But the body simply refuses to obey the spirit. As the Master wrestles with his divine future, just a stone's throw away, pouring out his soul in desperate prayer, you are consumed by a powerful, irresistible physical weakness. The fatigue is not a gentle lull. It is a dense, overwhelming anesthetic that seizes your limbs and dulls your senses. You try to fight it, struggling against the heavy pull of sleep that drags your eyelids down like weights. You slump against the cool, rough stone of the olive press, promising yourself that you will stay awake for just one more minute. But the debt of months of sleepless travel is suddenly called due. The moment your eyes close, you are plunged into an immediate, heavy darkness. When the Master returns, not once but 3 times, his face etched with the spiritual agony of his own struggle, he finds you, his most trusted companions, collapsed in heavy sleep. His disappointment, though uttered in sorrow rather than anger, is a devastating rebuke. Could you not watch with me for 1 hour? You feel a surge of shame, guilt, and a desperate, futile attempt to justify your failure, muttering excuses about your heavy eyes and the lateness of the hour. But there is no justification. This is a failure of the flesh, a simple, fundamental inability to overcome the biological limits of your own human bodies under stress. The shame is twofold. First, you failed the Master at the peak of his anguish, abandoning him to his struggle through simple physical collapse. Second, you failed yourselves, confirming the spiritual weakness that all the previous failures had hinted at. The exhaustion is not just a sign of a grueling schedule. It is a profound spiritual vulnerability, highlighting how easily the physical constraints of life can override the most profound intentions of the spirit. Your human nature, raw and unyielding, betrayed the divine purpose. This physical collapse ensures that when the mob finally appears, you are already spiritually compromised and physically depleted. Your reflexes slow, your mind's cloudy, making the subsequent violence chaotic and overwhelming. The deep, chronic exhaustion that crippled you in Gethsemane is violently, terrifyingly interrupted by the sharp, shattering chaos of the arrest. This chapter is a sudden, brutal shift into primal terror. It focuses intensely on the fear of the armed mob, the confusing violence of the moment, and the immediate, panicked adrenaline that caused you to abandon your master and flee blindly into the darkness. The narrative details the raw, unthinking terror of that instant and the immediate, crushing, paralyzing guilt that followed the realization of your cowardice. The approach of the mob is not subtle. It is heralded by the distant, growing light of torches and the heavy, irregular sounds of many men moving quickly and silently. The sudden intrusion into the serene darkness of Gethsemane is shocking, a visual and auditory violation. The flickering, angry glow of the torches slices through the shadows, revealing a confused mass of temple guards, officials, and low-level thugs, all armed with an assortment of swords, clubs, and lamps. The cold weight of the Roman contingent stands back, their presence a silent, terrifying assertion of the ultimate secular authority underwriting the arrest. The confusion is total. You are still half asleep, your minds slow from exhaustion, unable to process the speed and terrifying purpose of the intrusion. The betrayal of Judas, the kiss that singles out the master, happens in a flash of incomprehensible intimacy and cruelty. A moment so shocking that it paralyzes your attempts at coherent action. The scene explodes into violence immediately after the signal is given. There is the immediate, panicked adrenaline surge, a flood of pure, unthinking instinct that overrides all theology, all loyalty, and all self-control. The instinct is simple: survival. You see the cold steel of the weapons, you hear the rough, angry shouts of the temple guards, and the primal brain takes over. There is no time for consultation, no moment for courage, and certainly no organized resistance. Your small, desperate attempt at defense, Peter's hasty, clumsy swing of a single sword, which connects with nothing but the ear of the high priest's servant, is immediately rebuked by the master. His insistence on peace, on allowing the violence to take its course, is the final, baffling command that breaks your already fragile resolve. He stops the violence you wished for, and in doing so, he removes the only possible path of resistance, leaving you utterly helpless. The moment the soldiers lay hands on the master, binding his arms roughly behind him, the bond of the group instantly dissolves. The disciples who had promised to follow him to death execute a total, panicked rout. You don't flee as a unit. You scatter like startled animals caught in a sudden snare. You are driven by the raw, unadulterated terror of being recognized, arrested, and linked to a man who is now clearly marked for immediate and brutal execution. The adrenaline surges, propelling your body away from the terrifying glow of the torches and into the absolute, concealing darkness of the olive grove. The fight or flight response has chosen flight, and it has chosen it without hesitation. Your flight is clumsy and humiliating. You stumble over roots, trip over loose stones, and tear your meager clothes on the low-hanging branches. Some of you tear free of your tunics, leaving behind garments as evidence of your desperate escape. The only sound is the rough, chaotic noise of your own frantic breathing and the deafening pounding of your heart. You realize, with a sickening jolt that hits harder than any club, that you have abandoned the master completely, leaving him alone and defenseless in the hands of his enemies. The shame of this betrayal hits you with the same physical force as the initial shock of the arrest. The terror of the moment gives way to the crushing weight of guilt. You ran. You promised loyalty. You promised death. And in the first moment of real danger, you prioritized your own lives over the master you swore to serve. This immediate, crushing guilt is not abstract. It is a hot, nauseating shame that burns in your gut as you continue to run, the scent of fear and the taste of betrayal bitter on your tongue. The chaos of their flight leads immediately to their frightened and isolated dispersion, leaving them alone and targets in the hostile foreign city. You are now fugitives, separated, and suddenly realizing the immense, terrifying solitude of the journey you must face alone, unable to return to the life you abandoned. The adrenaline that fueled the panicked flight from Gethsemane slowly burns out, leaving behind a cold, terrifying residue, the profound, absolute isolation of the fugitive. After the Master's arrest, the disciples were alone, scattered, and deeply ashamed. This chapter details the immediate, desperate need for hiding, the constant, sickening anxiety of being recognized as one of Jesus' followers, and the cold, terrifying solitude of being a fugitive in the very city they thought they were about to conquer. You are scattered across Jerusalem, a massive, crowded, and utterly hostile city. The city that was supposed to be the destination of triumph has instead become a vast, suffocating hunting ground where you are the prey. You cannot return to the safety of Galilee. The road is too long, and the risk of being intercepted is too high. You cannot seek refuge with your estranged families. The danger to them would be too great. You are trapped in the center of the enemy's power, utterly exposed and without resources. Every shadow is a potential hiding place, and every alleyway a necessary dead end. The fear of recognition is constant and consuming. Your rough, dusty clothing, the unkempt appearance detailed in chapter 9, now works against you, marking you immediately as outsiders. You stand out dramatically against the backdrop of the city dwellers, who are clean, settled, and suspicious of strange faces, especially during the volatile Passover week. Every passing glance from a stranger, every lingering look from a temple guard, sends a fresh wave of panic through you. You avoid the main streets, hug the walls of buildings, and speak only in hushed, nervous tones, terrified that your thick Galilean accent, the very accent that Peter's fear later confirmed as a mark of guilt, will betray your identity and lead to immediate arrest. The sickening anxiety of being identified is compounded by the knowledge that the authorities know your faces. They have seen you arguing with the scribes in the temple courts, standing by the Master during his public sermons, and sharing the last meal. You are not innocent bystanders. You are co-conspirators in what the Sanhedrin considers sedition and blasphemy. The fear is not just of prison, but of sharing the exact, brutal fate that is now being meted out to the Master, a public, humiliating death that strips away every last shred of dignity and memory. You are haunted by the thought of being dragged before the council, forced to justify a mission that now appears to have failed spectacularly. The isolation is total. You are separated not only from the Master, but, for the moment, from each other. Communication is almost impossible, relying on dangerous, furtive movements in the night to find a safe house or to relay essential information. You are reduced to an individual struggle for survival, the communal bond shattered by the violence and the shame of your flight. Each of you is alone, wrestling with the paralyzing guilt of having abandoned the master and the horrifying uncertainty of his fate. You imagine his silent suffering, contrasted with your own miserable, cowardly safety, and the moral pain is almost worse than the physical fear. The terror breeds a corrosive distrust. In this time of desperate survival, you question the loyalty of everyone. Who else has been arrested? Who might break under questioning and give up your hiding place? Is the man who shared your last piece of bread now looking for a reward by giving you up to the temple police? The suspicion that first tainted the communal purse now poisons your very desperate attempts to survive. You question the loyalty of everyone, even your closest companions, leading to a profound, chilling sense of solitude. This total collapse and isolation contrasts sharply with the brief, intoxicating memory of your most celebrated moment of public success. The triumphant entry into the city just days before. The memory of the palms, the shouts of Hosanna, and the feeling of divine vindication is now a painful, mocking phantom, a reminder of the height from which you have so quickly fallen. You went from expecting to rule the world within days to hiding in a dark corner, terrified by the sound of boots on the street. The grandeur of the promised kingdom has dissolved into the miserable reality of being a hunted, cowardly fugitive. The only thing left now is to watch, hidden and terrified, as the fate of the man you followed is violently and irrevocably decided, waiting for the inevitable moment when the next knock comes to your door. In the chilling solitude of hiding, the crushing guilt of betrayal, and the sickening fear of identification, your minds inevitably turn back to the one memory that still retains a blinding, painful glow. The brief, intoxicating moment of the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. This chapter provides a brief, reflective pause, looking back at that one fleeting moment of public triumph. The focus is not on the glory itself, but on the brief, ephemeral, and ultimately hollow nature of that success, describing the emotional crash that followed and the swift realization that the excitement was quickly replaced by political danger and personal doubt. Their inability to hold on to the glory forces them to accept the difficult truth of their global mission. That single day was meant to be the climax, the moment of divine vindication that proved every hardship, every sleepless night, every hungry mile was worth the price. You rode into the city alongside the master, not on a war horse, as the zealots would have demanded, but on a humble colt, fulfilling prophecy and commanding a spontaneous eruption of public fervor. The sound of the crowd was overwhelming, a unified, joyous roar that drowned out the cynical whispers of the Pharisees and silenced the cold arrogance of the Roman legionaries. You walked on robes and palm fronds, objects of sudden, vicarious celebrity. For those few hours, you were not dusty, ignorant fisherman or a despised tax collector. You were the trusted entourage of the King of Israel, the men who would shortly be given thrones and authority. It was a potent drug, the feeling of the crowd pressing in, not with demands or sickness, but with sheer, unadulterated admiration and conviction. The feeling of that glory was intoxicating, a powerful narcotic that wiped away the memory of all the previous failures and humiliations. You saw the faces of the people, their eyes shining with desperate, ecstatic hope, and you finally felt validated. The shame of your poverty vanished, replaced by the certainty of imminent, undeniable power. This was the payoff, the moment the kingdom was finally made manifest. The ultimate rebuke to the world that had mocked your mission for 3 grueling years. You walked taller, spoke louder, and looked at each other with triumphant, knowing smiles, a silent agreement passing between you that the wait was over, the suffering had paid off, and now, finally, the victory parade had begun. The sheer volume of the acclamation was a physical shield, making you feel invincible to the scrutiny of the temple guards or the silent watch of the Roman garrison, posted on the Antonia fortress overlooking the scene. But the memory is now a mocking torment, a sharp contrast to the damp, shadowed corner where you currently huddle. The euphoria was fleeting, lasting only hours before the political danger snapped back into place. The cheers of Hosanna faded almost instantly, replaced by the grim-faced machinations of the Sanhedrin and the cold, professional contempt of the Romans. The master's subsequent actions, the forceful cleansing of the temple, the public challenging of authority, the riddles directed at the chief priests, only accelerated the inevitable backlash, confirming that his path to the throne was not through popular acclaim, but through confrontation and suffering. The very next day, the popular fervor was already waning, replaced by weary political calculation among the leaders. The emotional crash that followed was brutal. The high of the triumphal entry was followed immediately by a profound sense of political exposure. The cheers made you visible, not as rulers, but as targets for everyone who opposed the master's message. The brief taste of glory was immediately replaced by the sickening realization that they had shown their hand too soon. They had declared their presence in the very place where their enemies held the highest authority, and the swiftness of the response was a deadly reminder of their true vulnerability. The memory, so sweet just a few days ago, now burns with the bitterness of a promise broken not by the master, but by the transient nature of human loyalty. The same crowds that shouted Hosanna would, within days, be manipulated into shouting for his crucifixion, proving that popular opinion is as changeable as the wind on the Sea of Galilee. This inability to hold on to the glory, the realization that their success was hollow and ephemeral, a mere whisper in the storm of political necessity, forces them to accept the difficult, terrifying truth of their global mission. The Master had spoken repeatedly of suffering, of a spiritual kingdom, and of going to the lost sheep of the world. They had always hoped that those commands were conditional, that a successful coup in Jerusalem would negate the need for hardship abroad. That brief, exhilarating moment of earthly glory was the last great temptation, proving that the true victory would not be found in the crowds of Jerusalem or the palaces of Judea. It would be found in the lonely, hard work of spreading a message to strangers in hostile lands, a future of guaranteed suffering they had desperately tried to avoid. The promise was not an earthly crown. It was the cross they must now learn to carry, a destiny that required them to abandon every comfort and seek out the very hardship they had so often fled. This painful acceptance of their true destiny is the prelude to the complete, radical change in their existence. Emerging from the shadow of the arrest and the shock of the crucifixion, The disciples are confronted with the full, terrifying weight of their impending duty. Their greatest hardship was realizing that their mission would not, in fact, end in a comfortable earthly kingdom, ruling from golden thrones in a liberated Jerusalem, but in a difficult, dangerous, and global ministry to strangers in hostile lands. This chapter explores the anxiety of their impending duty to leave the relative safety of their culture and home, facing a world that was actively hostile to their message and guaranteed them suffering. This new, bleak reality demands a radical, immediate change in their way of life. They must learn to survive with no security, relying only on the invisible. The promises of the Master, that they would sit on 12 thrones, judging the tribes of Israel, had been a glorious, comforting misunderstanding. They had interpreted the kingdom through the narrow, materialistic lens of zealot ambition, expecting a quick, decisive political victory that would elevate them from dusty fishermen to regional governors. The reality, revealed in the brutal clarity of the cross and confirmed by the Master's final, baffling command, was profoundly different. The kingdom was spiritual. Its expansion was global, and its methodology involved suffering, not conquering. Their final instruction, to go into all the world, starting from Jerusalem, was not a commission of authority that would be immediately recognized, but a terrifying summons to exile and danger, a declaration of perpetual war against the known world. The anxiety of this impending duty is immense, rooted in the deep-seated cultural fear of the unknown and the Gentile world. Leaving Judea meant leaving the known world, abandoning the protection of their familiar language, their ancestral laws, and the comforting rhythms of their Jewish identity. The security of being one of the people of God, surrounded by the familiar sights of the synagogue and the temple, was being forcibly stripped away. They were being asked to enter Gentile lands, vast, chaotic regions ruled by capricious Roman proconsuls, lands where their faith would be viewed as, at best, an absurd superstition, and at worst, a capital crime. The world they were being sent to, Syria, Asia Minor, Egypt, and perhaps even the great terrible city of Rome, was a terrifying void, filled with foreign customs, strange gods, and a language barrier that would sever them from the familiar comforts of home and the ability to explain themselves clearly. The fear of suffering is no longer an abstraction. They have just witnessed the ultimate price paid by their master, a public execution that was designed to break the spirit and humiliate the body. They know, with cold certainty, that embracing this global mission means signing their own death warrants. Every city outside Judea is a potential place of execution. Every voyage a possible disaster, and every stranger a potential betrayer, since the message they carry, that an executed peasant is the Son of God, is offensive to both Roman reason and Jewish theology. The easy path was to stay in Jerusalem and fade back into the crowd, seeking a quiet existence as itinerant teachers. The terrifying path was to step onto the roads that led to Rome, to Antioch, and to the endless, hostile East, facing a certainty of violent death. This bleak new reality demands a radical, immediate change in their way of life. They must learn to survive with no security, trusting only in the spiritual power they barely understand. The master's earlier instructions to carry no purse, no staff, and no extra tunic, which had previously felt like a temporary rule for a short mission, now becomes the permanent, terrifying operating procedure for their entire lives. They must consciously shed every vestige of material and political reliance. They cannot buy protection. They cannot rely on their former trades, and they cannot seek the backing of any earthly power. The shift is absolute. They transition from localized travelers with a vague hope of becoming ministers in Jerusalem to permanent, professional fugitives and missionaries. Their home is the road. Their security is the next hospitable doorway. And their only currency is the message they carry. This is the profound redefinition of discipleship, a permanent state of voluntary, radical insecurity that must be maintained until death. The spiritual strength that failed them in Gethsemane must now be forged in the crucible of this lifelong global journey. The future they didn't choose is a future of perpetual motion, perpetual danger, and perpetual dependence, a life that can only be sustained by the deliberate practice of radical non-attachment and faith. A life lived entirely on the razor's edge, utterly divorced from the stability and predictability that all other men crave. The terrifying mandate to go into the world facing guaranteed hostility and danger forces the disciples into the grueling, continuous process of adapting to a life of chronic uncertainty. This chapter focuses on the psychological and spiritual discipline required to learn to live on the edge, a life where their primary security was their faith, not a physical dwelling or a predictable income. It details the constant state of readiness, the deliberate practice of radical dependence on God and strangers, and the final, quiet acceptance of being perpetually foreign and unmoored in a world that craved stability, proving that their true endurance was in the surrender of control. This adaptation is a daily, painful discipline, a forced reshaping of the practical mind that had once relied on the tangible realities of nets, boats, and ledgers. Every morning, they must deliberately confront the lack of a plan. There is no route map beyond the direction of the next city, no prearranged lodgings, and no guaranteed source of food. They have to silence the innate, nagging voices of caution and provision, the voices that screamed at them to save a little food or keep a few coins hidden for an emergency. They learn to pray for their daily bread and trust that the answer will arrive, not through a dramatic, heaven-sent miracle, but through the unpredictable goodwill of a stranger or the sudden opportunity to work for a meal, often performing manual labor or small services in exchange for passage or a place to sleep. The constant state of readiness is physically and mentally exhausting. They are perpetually packed, always ready to move, to speak, or to flee at a moment's notice. Their possessions, a meager change of clothing, a scroll or two, and the most basic of eating implements, are always bundled and light, capable of being carried easily in a moment of flight. This physical lightness mirrors a necessary psychological lightness, a profound detachment from place and comfort that is utterly unnatural to men who grew up rooted to a single lake or a single trade. They must be fluid, capable of adjusting instantly to the customs of a Samaria village one day and the philosophical debates of a major Roman city like Ephesus or Athens the next. This demanded a constant intellectual and social agility they never possessed in their former lives, forcing them to become observant and adaptable in a way that was previously unimaginable. The radical dependence on strangers is perhaps the most humiliating and vital aspect of their new life. They, who once prided themselves on their self-sufficiency, must now walk up to the doors of unknown people, often Gentiles, with all the cultural and religious prohibitions that entailed, and ask for food and shelter, offering only a controversial, politically dangerous message in return. This practice is a deliberate spiritual exercise, a continuous humiliation that crushes the last vestiges of their pride and forces them to rely solely on the spiritual currency of their message. When rejected, they must accept it without resentment or anger. When welcomed, they must accept it without forming a permanent emotional attachment to the comfort provided. This emotional unmooring is the final price of the abandonment tax, ensuring that nothing earthly can ever fully claim their allegiance again. The final acceptance of being perpetually foreign and unmoored is a quiet, profound surrender, the ultimate realization of what it means to be a pilgrim. They realize they will never again belong wholly to any place on earth. Their loyalty is to the kingdom, and their citizenship is elsewhere. They become professional outsiders, finding a strange, durable security in their very lack of security. They learn to read the subtle signs of danger and hospitality with the acute perception of a hunted animal, becoming expert judges of character, capable of recognizing a kindred spirit in the eyes of a pagan convert or a lethal threat in the glare of a local magistrate. Their ability to survive now rests not on muscle or money, but on this acute, cultivated awareness of their surroundings and the unwavering belief that their mission, though deadly, is divinely protected. This adoption of a life on the razor's edge, reliant on the invisible hand of God and the unpredictable kindness of men, prepares them for the physical and political torture that historically awaited them. They have already given up comfort, possessions, and predictability. The only thing left to sacrifice is their body. By systematically detaching themselves from the world's rewards, they made the inevitable sacrifice of their lives merely the final step in a long, painful process of radical surrender. They were no longer afraid of losing what they had already freely given away. This chapter is a dramatic summation of the ultimate price they paid: persecution and martyrdom. It moves beyond the story of Jesus' life to the aftermath, detailing the historical reality of the disciples' brutal deaths and the certainty of suffering they willingly embraced. It starkly contrasts their early fear and failures with their final, unshakable courage, concluding that their true greatness was defined not by their miracles, but by the ultimate, total sacrifice of their own lives, providing the grim, final chapter to their tale of raw human endurance. The brief, shameful panic in Gethsemane, the 3 denials by Peter, and the general, chaotic flight of the 12 defined the lowest point of their spiritual journey. They were, in that moment, utterly human, choosing self-preservation over devotion, proving that their commitment was conditional when faced with the cold reality of the sword. But the period following the Master's death and resurrection forces a spiritual and psychological reckoning. The fear does not instantly vanish. It is tempered by a fierce, undeniable conviction in the truth they witnessed, a conviction that allows them to re-enter the very hostile arenas they fled from, fully aware of the consequences. The subsequent history of the disciples is a relentless chronicle of hardship, persecution, and execution. The future they chose was not a myth of glory, but a historical reality of pain, suffering, and public humiliation. They faced the full, crushing weight of Rome and the temple authorities, who saw them not as religious philosophers, but as dangerous, destabilizing fanatics whose message threatened the established order and the delicate political balance. Their reward for their faithfulness was not gold, but the axe, the cross, and the sword, with their mission becoming a guaranteed path to a brutal, premature end. Consider the reality of their final moments. James, the son of Zebedee, the very first of the 12 to fall, was executed by Herod's sword in a ruthless political calculation. A sudden, brutal act of terror designed to decapitate the nascent movement. Peter, who had denied the master 3 times out of fear of a servant girl, faced his final moments in Rome, tradition holding that he requested to be crucified upside down, deeming himself unworthy to die in the same manner as the Lord he had once abandoned, a final act of penitent humility and courage. Andrew was bound to an X-shaped cross in Patras, suffering a prolonged, agonizing death while continuing to preach to his executioners and the crowd for 2 days before he finally succumbed. Bartholomew was savagely flayed alive, dying a slow death that demonstrated the extreme barbarity of their opponents. Thomas, traveling far east, was run through with a spear in India while attempting to spread the message in a distant, hostile culture. Matthew, the former tax collector, was executed with an axe in Ethiopia, proving that his earlier social climbing meant nothing in the face of the kingdom's demands. These were not peaceful deaths in old age, surrounded by loved ones. They were violent public demonstrations of state power intended to crush the burgeoning movement through terror and torture. The disciples knew this. They saw their brethren die, one by one, facing the same fate, and yet they pressed on, walking willingly into the next hostile city, onto the next dangerous ship. Their failure in Gethsemane gave them a brutal realism. They understood the true weakness of the flesh, and they understood the true, non-negotiable cost of their mission. Their final, unshakable courage was not born of ignorance, but of the clear-eyed, conscious acceptance of a fate they had been running from their entire ministry. The contrast between their early fear and their final resolve is the defining tragedy and triumph of their legacy. They had feared the ridicule of the zealots, the angry mob, and the sudden storm, yet they ultimately walked into martyrdom, unafraid of the most terrifying execution the world could devise. They had failed the Master in his hour of greatest need, but in their own final hours, their loyalty was absolute, unshakable, and terrifyingly complete. Their deaths were not accidental. They were the final, ultimate cost of their decision to follow, the final payment of the abandonment tax. The disciples' true greatness, the raw, human lesson they leave behind, is that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to endure the inescapable, violent conclusion that their mission demanded. It is this profound, lasting impact of their raw endurance, not their flawless faith, that defines their enduring legacy. The concluding chapter shifts the perspective one last time, reflecting not on the dramatic violence of their martyrdom, but on the profound cumulative weight of their simple, daily endurance. Their true legacy is not defined by the grand, supernatural events that surrounded them, but by the raw, human capacity to persist through the impossible grind of the everyday. This chapter ties all the low-level physical hardships, the endless walking, the chronic hunger, the extreme heat, the social shaming, the pervasive fear, to the spiritual weight of their global mission, concluding that their ultimate greatness was their ability to endure, day after grueling day, until the final breath. Look back at the first step taken by Simon, leaving the profitable net on the shore, and trace that path forward through the years, from Galilee to the distant, hostile corners of the Roman Empire and beyond. The thousands upon thousands of miles covered on dusty, abrasive roads. The nights spent shivering on cold, hard ground or damp floors. The constant, dull ache of chronic nutritional deficits. The deep, profound humiliation of being questioned and mocked by the educated elite in synagogues and forums. The constant, draining anxiety of being a political target, a fugitive who could be arrested or executed at any moment. These were not singular, heroic events, but a continuous, unrelenting stream of physical and psychological stress that formed the true crucible of their discipleship. Any one of those failures, any one of those hardships, the betrayal, the public shaming, the near drowning, the constant hunger, would have been enough to send an ordinary man back to the reliable safety of his home and his trade. Their genius was their stamina. It was their raw, simple refusal to quit. They were not chosen because they were the most intelligent, the most theologically sound, or the most spiritually advanced. They were chosen because they had the ingrained, stubborn, unyielding resilience of common laborers. Men whose lives had been forged in the uncompromising, unforgiving elements of the sea and the field. They possessed the brute, human capacity to wake up every morning, despite the previous day's failure, despite the gnawing hunger that never truly left them, and despite the political peril that hung over them like a permanent cloud, and keep walking toward the next impossible task. This sheer, dogged persistence is the heart of their story. This capacity for endurance became the central vehicle of the message itself. The Master was divine. His miracles were proof of his nature, but the disciples were fundamentally, imperfectly human. Their true power was not in their ability to perform miracles, but in their persistent, demonstrable refusal to abandon a cause that cost them everything and offered them nothing but pain in return. Their willingness to endure the impossible grind, the sheer, obstinate fact that they kept preaching until their very last breath, is the undeniable proof of the transformation that occurred within them, a quiet, inner work that overshadowed every visible miracle they performed. This endurance is the spiritual lesson they leave for the world. Faith is not a single, lightning strike moment of understanding. It is the long, difficult journey of persistence. It is the commitment to keep walking when the road is painful, when the body is weak, and when the mind is confused by suffering and political reality. Their failures, the fighting over status, the fear in the storm, the sleep in Gethsemane, the flight from the garden, do not negate their legacy. They define it, making their ultimate commitment all the more profound and relatable. Their victory was not in their perfection, but in the immense, agonizing distance they covered between their initial, self-serving fear and their final, humble, world-changing sacrifice. The mission was never intended to be easy, and the cost was never meant to be negotiable. But the ultimate conclusion of their struggle is a quiet, profound security for those who came after. They suffered the full, crushing weight of the world, paid the full, brutal cost of their loyalty, and emerged victorious not because they conquered earthly empires, but because they conquered the self and the natural human instinct for survival at all costs. They chose to pay the abandonment tax, to live on the edge of society, to endure the shame, the fear, and the ultimate violent end of their earthly lives. And so, you who followed their journey, who felt the grit in your teeth and the ache in your legs, can finally find rest. The disciples are gone, the storms are stilled, and the long, weary journey is complete. They consciously chose to sacrifice all the comfort you value, enduring until the very end. The cost has been paid. You may now rest secure in the knowledge that they walked that impossible road so you would not have to.